What's up, everybody? Thank you for stopping by. This is going to be another class guide for Battle for Azeroth, patch 8.0.1. This time we're going to switch gears from the Spellcaster into Melee. And I decided that I want to do a video on arms, because arms warriors are one of my favorite classes. So we're just going to go over the main moves to arms really quick, just so you have some general knowledge. One of your main damaging abilities is called Mortal Strike, so it costs 30 rage, and it's about a 5-second cooldown. Now, it's a strong hit, and it basically reduces healing on the person who received the hit by a quarter for 10 seconds. So it's very useful not only in damaging, but also for killing healers, because you are essentially, if they receive a heal for 1,000, they're only getting 750. So that's a really strong move. Overpower is another move that's slightly less strong than Mortal Strike. However, it can't be blocked, can't be dodged, and it can't be parried. So it will always hit, and it increases or buffs the damage of your next Mortal Strike by 20%, and it stacks 2 times. So if you use Overpower twice, your next Mortal Strike will do 40% more damage. So those two work together. Now, the third unique part to arms is going to be sweeping strikes. Now, this is a cleave, not as much an AoE, but it's a cleave. So you activate this like a clickable buff, and it's a 30-second cooldown. And what it's going to do is change your single target damage abilities, so things like Mortal Strike and Overpower. It's going to change them into something that hits 2 targets, and as long as it's within 8 yards, and it's going to do 75% of the damage of the original hit. So if your Mortal Strike, for easy math, did 1,000 damage, it's going to do 750 damage to another target within 8 yards. So it's a really nice way to make some cleave without having to be stacked right on the enemy. Die by the Sword is your defensive mitigation. It's kind of a long cooldown, but it's very strong. You're going to want to pop this whenever enemies have you targeted and they're blowing cooldowns on you. You basically can nullify a lot of damage with the 100% reduction or buff to your parry chance, and then it reduces all damage you take by 30% for 8 seconds. So especially useful for raid mechanics, PvP when you're getting freaking torn up. Colossus Smash. Now this is one of the most pivotal parts of the build for utilizing arms and being good. So Colossus Smash smashes your enemy's armor, deals a high damage, and increases the damage you deal to them by 30% for 10 seconds. And it can further be buffed by talents to be an AoE or an area of effect damage, which makes it very strong, and we'll talk about that a lot more. Blade Storm is your signature 1-minute cooldown AoE meat cleaver attack. You hit all enemies within 8 yards for a high amount of damage over 4.7 seconds or 5 seconds. You're immune to movement impairing and loss of control, but you can use defensive abilities. So if you're blade storming in a group of enemies, you can absolutely pop Die by the Sword. You can pop your defensive stance. You can pop your rallying cry, which is like an HP buff, which is one of the few raid-wide buffs for Battle for Azeroth right now. So those are your main bread and butter moves. So just understanding what those are and how they work will help you go through the talents with me. So let's go into the talents. I would recommend grabbing an add-on called Talent Set Manager. And what this does is it lets you set up talent sets exactly like you would normally be setting up like character equipment, okay? So when you pop this open, if you're going to PvP, you can have a set dedicated to PvP. If you're raiding and you like a specific configuration, you can click and it saves all of these, and you can make new ones. You can, put anything you want in there. It's super handy, and I really like it. So try that out if you don't have it. I'm just going to go through here quick, and I'm going to leave these up for like 5 seconds a piece so you can pause the video and take whatever you want. So for PvP, this is what I use. For raiding, this is what I use. For dungeons, this is what I use. And for Mythic Plus, this is what I use. Alright, so everyone who's just here for talents and doesn't care about the theory behind it, you know, there you go. You've got it. And you can see here for PvP talents, I take the Medallion, I take Death Sentence, I take Sharpened Blade, Storm of Destruction, and War Mode's always on. It's got to be on. Alright? So if you are here for that and you've got the information you want and you want to see rotation advice and stuff like that, that's going to be later in the video. So I'll put a link down there to it so you can click that and get out of here. If you're here to read more about the talents, I'm going to go into that real quick here. I'm just going to start in PvP mode because that's the mode that well, more people probably wouldn't like Mythic Plus, but so to start out for level 15, you've got 3 talents. You've got War Machine, Sudden Death, and Skullsplitter. War Machine is basically going to give you more rage and increased movement speed and mobility. So it's really strong for dungeons and Mythic Plus. The catch is you have to be killing enemies to activate it. So if you're in high level Mythic Plus where shit's barely dying, like it takes a long time, maybe not, but for most Mythic Plus, it works really well. For dungeons, like a heroic, for a daily heroic, it works insanely well because stuff barely lasts 10 seconds, you know? So anywhere where you're killing a lot of stuff and you need mobility and rage, War Machine is king. Sudden Death, this is going to make your execute, which we talked about earlier. So it's going to make it free, and it's going to make it hit at max damage, and it's going to make it usable on any enemy regardless of how much life they have. So for execute, this is going to be normally a finisher, so it deals a high amount of damage, and it deals more based on rage spent, so you can spend 20 up into 40. Now the cool thing about Sudden Death is when you activate Sudden Death at 20 rage, it's going to hit like you dealt with 40 rage. So it buffs your it buffs your execute and makes it free, and it makes it usable on any enemy regardless of their HP. So it's very strong, and especially for sections where, like for raiding, where you might need to kill ads quickly, but maybe they're not in execute range, so which is 20 to 35% depending on how you're talented. So it can be very strong. I would really recommend this for raiding, and I would recommend it for Mythic Plus, or let's see, for raiding and for PvP. Sorry. Skullsplitter adds another move into your rotation. It's a moderately strong 1800 and some-ish physical damage, and it's just another move. But what's cool about it is it does help even out the rotation a little bit. It's an instant, and it's not exceptionally high cost in rage. So if you feel like you've got downtime in your rotation and you're raiding and you're looking to smooth your damage out and keep it sustained, I would take Skullsplitter. Double time I would take for any time you need more mobility, so I usually take it for dungeons and for Mythic Plus because you're steamrolling this content at this point in the game, so you're always needing a chance to go flying further, faster, you know, toward enemies. Impending Victory I have not used very much. You already have a move that procs to heal you, and that is your Victory Rush. So whenever you kill an enemy, you will get this buff that gives you the chance to use this, and it heals you for 20% of your HP. Personally, I find that to be plenty of healing. The Impending Victory has a 30-second cooldown, which I don't think is very great, but I mean, you maybe situationally you might be able to use it, but I think personally just being on top of your Victory Rush is plenty. Stormbolt I take for PvP, and I take for any time that you need a strong interrupt or like a strong stun. This lasts for 4 seconds. God, I wish 14 seconds. 4 seconds and deals a small amount of damage too. So it's especially good for locking down healers. You know, if you've got a healer at 20% HP, he's just about to pop a really strong spell and heal, you can bop him with that and then finish him off with an execute. Cha! So it's really strong for that. or say you're in Mythic Plus and you need to stun some really hard-hitting ads or something, it can be really useful there too. For level 45 talents, Massacre, personally, I feel like Massacre is king for any time where you can have a lot of time to spend on the enemy. So basically what it does is it changes your execute from being usable at 20% to being usable at 35%. Now think about it this way. If you're in a raid boss has a lot of HP. So if you have an extra 15% of a raid boss's life, that's a long time to be spamming execute and getting more damage. If you are in a heroic dungeon where things are living for like 3 seconds or 1 second in that 35% HP range, not really worth it, right? You might get one execute, but you probably would have gotten that execute anyway, right? So Massacre for high health stuff and raid stuff. So I take it for raid and I take it for Mythic Plus. Now, Fervor of Battle, I like it for dungeons, and reason being is it buffs your whirlwind, and it also attaches a single target move to it called Slam. Now, Slam is your filler spell. It's a low priority, but it's like a filler for your rotation when you don't have anything better to do. This will add Slam to your whirlwind, making it a strong single target hit, and also buffing your whirlwind damage and filling out a little AoE. So that's real nice for things like heroic dungeons, or maybe Mythic Plus would be okay too. But for stuff that's where things are going to die pretty quick and there's not a lot of like tick time for things, you know what I mean? Rend. Now this is really strong for some place where you would need, like for example, PvP. So you're constantly chasing down enemies. Having another bleed on your enemy is going to help kill them when they're out of reach. So Rend actually is pretty comparable from what I've read to Massacre. So if you want something that you can just apply Rend and you don't have to worry about hitting an execute window, you know, you don't have to worry about anything other than just keeping it applied, it's very strong, and it's really strong especially for PvP, I think, and for raiding it's very strong if you can keep the constant uptime up. Alright? Level 60, I do not take Second Wind, I never have, but basically what it means is if you haven't taken damage for 5 seconds, you're going to start to gain HP. Now, in a raid circumstance, sometimes that's possible to happen, but most of the time you're taking a little bit of damage every once in a while. So I feel like this wouldn't be a very strong pick for raiding and stuff. Maybe for PvP if you're running around and you don't want to be eating and you don't have a healer, but personally I think it's a little weak. Bounding Stride, now this is going to be for utility and movement. This is going to reduce the cooldown on Heroic Leap. Now if you don't know what Heroic Leap is, it is your warrior gap closer. It's a 30-second cooldown, 8 to 40 yard range, so you can't cast it right next to you, but it has a 40 yard range, so you can jump really far. You fly through the air, you land, do a little bit of damage when you land. But if you take Bounding Stride, it reduces that cooldown from 30 seconds to 15, and it also buffs your run speed for 3 seconds significantly after you land. And personally, I really like this. I like it for Mythic Plus. I like it for dungeons because it helps you move. Raid, it can be situationally good. If you've got a lot of movement in the raid, take it. If you don't have a lot of movement, you know, take something like Defensive Stance so you could mitigate some damage for your healers. But if you need to move, Bounding Stride is king. So for your level 75 talents, Collateral Damage. So this buffs a move called Sweeping Strikes. Sweeping Strikes is a clickable move, so it's a 30-second cooldown. When you click it for the next 12 seconds, if you do a damage like Overpower or Mortal Strike or Slam, something that is a single target damage, it's going to add that onto a nearby enemy as long as they're within 8 yards, and it's going to do 75% of the original damage to them. So it's a buff, and it helps you cleave, or like split cleave a little bit. Now, what's cool about this is not only does it split cleave, with this talent, it's going to refund 20% of the rage cost. So if you find that you're rage starved, you could use this to gain some rage back. Personally, I don't take it, but there's probably some situations where it could be good. Warbreaker, personally, I think this talent is the freaking king. I use it for everything, although there is some situations where I might use Cleave. I still have to mess with it, but Warbreaker. So this replaces your Colossus Smash, and it replaces it with basically a buffed AoE version of itself. So instead of hitting one enemy for a high damage and increasing the damage you do to one enemy, it makes it an AoE, and it makes it within 8 yards. So it's a super strong AoE hit, followed by a weakness to everything you've hit is going to get hurt more by you. So if you charge in and use Warbreaker and then use Blade Storm, it's like a meat grinder. You just AoE, it's great. So I would recommend Warbreaker most all the time. And Warbreaker actually plays very well with a certain legendary, Weight of the Earth. Now this is the legendary I would say you really need to play this build super well. And you could get away with it to not have it, but basically what it does is it makes your heroic leap turn into basically another Warbreaker minus the strong initial hit damage. Like, it's going to increase the radius of the splash, so you're going to get an increased radius, which would be, let's see, it doesn't say, 16 yards is the normal radius for heroic leap, so it's going to actually double that, I think. Yep, so that would be 32 yards, and it's going to apply Colossus Smash debuff to all those enemies. So it's a super strong way to basically get another Warbringer minus the initial damage, and it's a good way, even single target, to use this to keep stacking your Colossus Smash debuff on your enemy, which is really high priority. So Warbringer is badass, use it. Cleave could also be good in a situation, and what it does is it's a strike, hits all enemies in front of you for a relatively low amount of damage, but if you hit 3 or more enemies, it inflicts deep wounds. Now, deep wounds, if you want to look it up and just see really quick, it's a mastery-based talent, and it's basically a bleed. So if you can't hit at least 3 enemies, you're going to miss out on the bleed for 6 seconds, and it's not going to be good. Like, you're going to get the initial small damage, but you're not going to get the big bleed damage. So only take Cleave if there is enemies that are going to live a minimum of 6 seconds after you've cleaved, and if you want something that's going to be a more even-keeled AoE. So Warbreaker, as good as it is, has a 45-second cooldown. If you're constantly fighting AoE where you need to be cleaving over and over and over all the time, Cleave can pull ahead. But personally, I take Warbreaker. Cleave is probably my second choice. Level 90, in for the kill, basically makes your Warbreaker even more awesome. So you use Warbreaker, it's going to increase your haste by 10%. If the target is below 20%, it's going to increase it by 20%. So it's a big buff to your haste, and your haste is a pretty strong stat for warriors. So in for the kill is really good for like a raid situation. It's really good for somewhere where you can constantly use it on cooldown and you're never lacking for an enemy. And also in a time where, you know, in an execute phase, for example, if the target's below 20% HP, it's going to boost your haste by 20%. So that really adds a really nice addition to your massacre, because, or not massacre, but to your execute in general, because it's going to make you even faster. And the haste is a strong stat for warriors, so that's a good pick. Avatar basically gives you a clickable strong damage buff for 20 seconds, 1.5 minute cooldown, removes stuns and snares, so it's very good for PvP. It's really good for bursting on healers. It's a big flat 20% damage increase, and it gets you out of stuns and snares. It's really strong. Pair it with any kind of other cooldowns you have, like a racial or a trinket proc, and you will shit on people. So it's a really good one, but keep in mind 1.5 minute cooldown kind of takes a long time. Deadly Calm. Now, I haven't taken this one myself, but there are some situations where I've figured it could be useful. It's going to reduce the rage cost of your abilities 100%, so they're free for 6 seconds. Now, the only time this could be really handy is if you're dumping into a move. So, say you get an execute, and you want to, you've procced your in for the kill. You've got your 20% haste. You're within your window for massacre, and you just want to go ham on some executes. You could pop Deadly Calm and just bash, 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 bash for 6 seconds and get 6 executes off. So it's pretty strong. I think if you use it right, it could be good. But I like Avatar because it's a little more simple. But either of these would probably be a good pick for raid content. For PvP, I would say probably Avatar because of the stun and snare escape. Level 100, Anger Management is a really awesome one. For every 20 rage you spend, you reduce the cooldown on Warbreaker and Bladestorm by 1 second. So it's a passive, and it's a very strong passive because you're always generating and spending rage. For every 20 you generate, it's going to reduce the cooldowns on 2 of your very strong moves, and that's a super good pick. I would pick this one. Actually, I think I pick this one all the time right now. Dreadnought basically makes your Overpower have 2 charges. So the one that buffs your Mortal Strike is Overpower. You use that twice, you'll have 40% buff on Mortal Strike. So Dreadnought gives you 2 charges, and it increases the damage of them. So that can be strong too. I haven't taken it personally, but I think it could be good. Ravager. So this replaces your Bladestorm and turns it into a ranged version, and it generates rage for you. So this might be good in situations like the brawl that's currently going on for PvP, where if a warrior runs into that giant shitstorm in the middle, you'll just die. But if you could throw a Ravager in there and stay out of the way, it could be good. So like AoE where you need to be careful, or AoE that you might benefit from the range, you could take that. But personally, I always take Anger Management. I think it's the best. And let's look real quick and go over any spells that we might have not touched on. So Battle Shout is back. So this is going to be your buff for the raid, and it's an attack power buff for everyone. So you click it, you're going to Battle Shout, and it's going to be everyone around you. Berserker Rage. This is another instant move. It's 1 minute cooldown. It basically grants immunity to fear, sap, and incapacitate for 6 seconds. So very useful in PvP. Not so useful in PvE, but it has situational use. We already went over Bladestorm. Charge is like your bread and butter move for getting into a place and also generating some rage. So it generates 20 rage, you fly in, deal a small amount of damage, and you root for 1 second. So that's going to be your opening move most of the time. Defensive Stance is like your turtle. We already talked about that. We already talked about Die by the Sword, Execute. Hamstring. This is mostly useful in a situation where enemies are escaping you, especially healers or slippery PvP battles where enemies outmaneuver you. Use Hamstring, and it's a 15-second duration that they get to move at half speed, so it's a very strong equalizing factor for you as a warrior, so use that. Heroic Leap we went over. Heroic Throw, fairly useless except for a small amount of damage, and it's ranged, so you could pull a mob with it if you needed to, but it's fairly useless, I think. Intimidating Shout. Now this is going to be like especially useful in PvP if you're getting ganged up on. You can use this to target an enemy and it makes them cower, and then people around them also cower or flee. So if you're getting torn up by enemies and you need people to get off of you, Intimidating Shout. Mortal Strike we talked about, Overpower we talked about. Pummel, that is your interrupt, and it's a melee version, so you've got to be close to use it, but it's a 15-second cooldown, just an interrupt. Rallying Cry, we touched on this, but it's a 3-minute cooldown. Basically, it grants 15% temporary maximum life for 10 seconds raid-wide. So, like, say, for example, if you're facing Tayshalak and he's casting Rend and your raid is about to get torn up by the next Rend, you could pop Rallying Cry, give everyone 15% more HP. Maybe you would live through that hit. So that's like what that kind of stuff is for. Rend we already touched on. Sharpened Blade is the PvP talent, one of the ones that I took. Now, you know how when I told you earlier that Mortal Strike is a strong attack, but it also reduces healing effectiveness on the person you hit for 10 seconds? Sharpened Blade capitalizes on that, and you do 30% increased damage, and you reduce their healing by a further 50%. So it basically powers up Mortal Strike to be stronger, but only for 4 seconds. So if you're on a healer and you're trying to finish them off, and they're casting a lot of spells and they're starting to heal up, you could use this to do some extra anti-healing mitigation on them. Slam is your filler spell, kind of low to medium damage. Use that when you've got nothing else to use. Stormbolt we touched on is going to be physical damage and a stun. Use it whenever you need a stun. Sweeping Strikes makes a single target hit 2 targets. Taunt, you're not going to have much need for taunt unless you're doing open world content and you're trying to pull, like if you were working with somebody and you want to pull an enemy off of your healer or something, or in raid if the tank's stupid and he's facing the boss toward the raid and he's going to kill everyone, you could be noble and taunt the boss and turn it around for him. The people will hate you, but it's kind of useless, but whatever. Victory Rush we already talked about. It's just basically a heal proc. When you kill an enemy, this little button will shine and it'll say, you can use a Victory Rush to heal 20% of your HP. Warbreaker we talked pretty extensively about. Whirlwind we already talked about. And your passives, we already talked about. Deep Wounds, it's a bleed, 6-second bleed. Your mastery influences it. And Seasoned Soldier, your auto attacks generate more rage. So as an arms warrior, your two-hander, generates a lot more rage. Tactician, you have a 1.40% chance per rage spent to reset the cooldown on Overpower. So Overpower will proc Tactician occasionally. Just use it whenever it procs. Alrighty, so we're going to jump right into the rotation here. First of all, you're going to decide how many enemies you're attacking. So we've got 3 training dummies here. I'm just going to go in on these 3, and just that way it's kind of a hybrid. So first of all, make some sort of macro for your burst cooldowns. And for me, I did one for Avatar. I did a /use for Blood Fury, so that's going to activate the Orc Racial. And then 13 and 14 are your trinkets. So if you look at your C, these are slots 13 and 14. So if you've got a trinket that is usable, it'll use it. So make something like that and make it easy on yourself so you can just click one button, there's all your cooldowns. And if you put something like this here, you can watch the cooldowns of, or how much longer you've got on your cooldowns visually, so you can time them out and you don't have to click them a million times. So we're going to charge in. We're going to basically, since there's 3 enemies, we're going to Warbreaker first, get that buff going. Then we're going to Blade Storm. Then after that, we're going to activate Sweeping Strikes. We're going to spread our Rend. And then we're going to use Sweeping Strikes to use Overpower, Mortal Strike, and Slam. That way, you're bursting with your heaviest burst first, which is your Blade Storm, and it's completely buffed by Warbringer. Then you're using Sweeping Strikes to hit the extra target here. And then once your Warbreaker debuff or Colossus Smash debuff is gone from Warbreaker, we're going to jump back in with Heroic Leap, and we're going to reactivate that debuff on the enemies again, since we have that Weight of the Earth. Alright, so here we go. We're going to jump in here, we're going to pop our cooldowns and do our thing. So charge in, cooldowns, Warbringer, Blade Storm. As soon as Blade Storm is up, Sweeping Strikes. Make sure you spend your execute procs first. Stack that rend. Keep going. Our debuff is off, so jump back in and reapply. Just keep going. And you're just going to rinse and repeat. It's pretty much the same exact cycle. If you have the time and the energy, keep up your rends. They're a pretty good amount of damage. Keep your Warbringer up there. And you can see if you time it out right, my Blade Storm and my Heroic Leap are going to come off pretty much about the same time. A few seconds apart. So you're going to leap back in, Blade Storm again, and you got all those fresh damages on there. So that's pretty much how it goes. Alrighty, so we've gone over AoE, we've gone over some cleave. Let's go over a bit of single target. These are the talents I usually take. I actually don't usually take Rend, I usually take Massacre, but I can't show that on a dummy, so I'll just show Rend. They're both pretty much comparable, so take whichever one you find easier to manage. So take Sudden Death. Any proc you get of Sudden Death on your execute, use it. Double time, I like that so I could move around for the encounter. Rend, keep that up all the time if you take it. Massacre, if you take it, make sure you're utilizing that 15% extra window of execute. Keep on top of it, that way it's worth taking. Bounding Stride for the additional movement. Warbreaker for the AoE. Sometimes you'll have ads and stuff in a raid. It's not always single target, so Warbreaker is a nice way to have some cleave and also have that awesome Colossus debuff. So use Warbreaker to set up your Colossus Smash debuff, and then use Heroic Leap to reapply. Avatar basically cast on cooldown with as many other effects as you can, and then Anger Management takes care of itself. So we're going to charge in here, going to Rend, cast our buffs, Blade Storm. As soon as we come out, we're going to use that proc. Keep our Rend up, keep our Mortal Strike going. Dive back in here, and just keep going. Keep that Rend on, and that's it. It's pretty much all you do for the single target. Just keep that rotation going and you'll be fine. Alright, well I think that's going to do it for me. This has been a pretty long video, but I hope it's been helpful to you guys, and I will see you next time.